In today's episode of Today in World War II, the Japanese launch a major offensive in China. A German submarine takes out a Royal Navy battleship. The Germans start a very bad history of executing Soviet prisoners. Adolf Hitler orders the seizure of the French fleet in Toulon, France. The last surface battle of the Solomon Island campaign in the South Pacific takes place, and a Japanese ship gets swarmed and killed, sunk by American carrier aircraft in the Philippines. Let's get started. So today, the Japanese 11th Army launched an offensive in Hubei province, China. I think that most people, even those who are amateur historians like I am, who I love studying World War II, I don't think a lot of Western people study the what happened in China. If they do, they probably think about the Burma Road, about Chiang Kai-shek, and the Flying Tigers, things like that, because that's where Americans participated or British personnel participated. But most of the war in China happened closer to the coast, and there was no Americans involved or British or Canadians or anybody else there. It was just the Japanese versus the Chinese. And you have no idea, I think, maybe you do, how many millions of Chinese the Japanese army killed from 1937 until the end of the war in 1945. It is astounding how many Chinese were killed in that war by the Japanese. My wife is Russian. I spent a lot of time in Russia, speak Russian fluently. And of course, the term 20 million comes up whenever people talk about how many civilian and military losses the Soviet Union suffered. Uh, China was in second place as far as losses, and they had millions of people who died under the Japanese. So there's no love lost even now between the Chinese and the Japanese, even though it's been what, 70, 80 years since the war ended. Those types of losses leave a big scar. And so, but China was so massive and so many people that the Japanese could never think that they could, completely control China. It's like a python trying to swallow an elephant whole. It just wasn't available. So they pretty much stuck to the coast, but they pretty much kept attacking most of the war. But again, strategically, did it help them? No. China was not going to invade Japan. China was not going to bomb their cities. It was the Americans that were going to do that. But the bulk of the Japanese army never fought the Americans in World War II. They stayed in China. So that's interesting. Again, just another example of how flawed the Japanese strategy was in World War II. So, yeah, hey, November 25th, 1940. Great, guys. 11th Army attacks China. Wonderful. That's better than going after, having those troops and those divisions available to throw against the Philippines and Australia, which is what they would have been better served to do strategically. But I digress. What I don't digress about is that you need to subscribe to my channel. Okay. All it takes is 2 seconds. Just go to the subscribe button and then click on the bell that notifies you that whenever I drop a new video, I drop these pretty much every day. So if you like my content, then you're going to want to be notified when those videos happen. Thank you. Okay, on November 25th, 1941, the German submarine U-331 torpedoed a British battleship, HMS Barham, in the Mediterranean Sea. Uh, Lucky shot in a sense because it went off right below the magazine of the battleship, and the magazine ignited, blew up the entire thing. So, out of a crew of 1,258 sailors, fewer than 400 survived. That's what happens when you have a catastrophic explosion from a magazine from one of the turrets. I just want to say this: you might ask yourself, well, what was the British battleship doing out there? Why was it out there being vulnerable to a U-boat attack? Well, remember, from 40 to 43, uh, actually, well, probably into 42, Malta was the center of naval activity and battles and air battles in the Mediterranean theater because Malta was a British colony. It was a port, it was a submarine base, airfields were there, and it was sandwiched between Sicily and Libya, which for the most part, well, Libya was for the most part was controlled by the Italians and the Germans. And then you had, of course, the Italians and the Germans could attack from Sicily, which is like 50 miles away. So they were under constant bombardment, and the Royal Navy just went, just did wonders and took so many losses to keep supplying Malta. And it was, for many times, it was a questionable thing whether Malta could survive and not starve to death or have to surrender. But that's why these British capital ships were in harm's way because they were had to escort the convoys because the Italian Navy could sweep out and did many times to try to sink those ships. They had to escort them. They had to have more than just destroyers there. So, I feel bad for the brave crew of the British battleship, but that's kind of like the background to that. There is no background to liking and commenting on a video. You should, if you like this video, then you are morally obligated to click that like button and then leave a comment, even if it just says, "I like your video." Even if you just say, "Frankly, I used to have a crush on my neighbor." It doesn't matter. The algorithm doesn't read the comment. They just want to see that there's a comment there. It's engagement, helps my channel grow. So if you want to support my channel, support the growth by doing that stuff. Okay. Thank you. Very somber note in November 25th, 1941, the very first execution of Soviet prisoners took place at Dachau concentration camp. And why is this? This is they say first execution because it wasn't the last. I will tell you that for those of us who are into World War II and grew up on the history and the movies, you know, the Germans obeyed the Geneva Convention. The Allies, the Western Allies obeyed the Geneva Convention. So we didn't slaughter each other's prisoners. They were kept in more or less humane conditions. Neither side on the Eastern Front obeyed the Geneva Convention. And I'm not saying the Soviets were any saints by any means, but I will tell you this: what the Germans did from the very get-go when they invaded the Soviet Union, and remember, they had free reign. They took millions of Soviet prisoners in the first 2 or 3 months of the war. They had huge encirclements. They would, take a million prisoners at a time. Well, you know what the Germans did? You may or may not know, but in many cases, they would just set up barbed wire around the prisoners in fields and just wait for them to die. That's how bad it was. I mean, I'm frankly surprised that these Soviet prisoners who was executed at Dachau, that the Germans took the trouble to ship them to Dachau, because the majority of the Soviet prisoners, they just were either executed outright or starved to death on the fields on the steppes of Ukraine and White Russia and so on and so forth. So just barbaric behavior from the Nazis, but then that was their trademark, was barbarism, right? Which is why we needed as a free world, to come together and destroy them. Okay, so on today's date, November 25th, 1942, Adolf Hitler ordered the seizure of the French fleet in Toulon. Now, I talked about this in yesterday's video about why this was such a contentious thing here, because after the French surrendered in 1940, there was, Toulon was the main French base for the French fleet. And then you had a couple bases on North Africa in Algiers and in French Morocco. And so the when the Americans and the Brits invaded North Africa in 42, there was some gunfire between the French, the Vichy French, and the Allies, but it was stopped pretty quickly. And so then, of course, those ships went over to the American, or not American, I'm sorry, the Allied side. But of course, there was we weren't going to invade southern France in 1942. So, but remember, the French had always told the Allies, we will never let the Germans get our ships. Well, Adolf Hitler put them to the test. And so he ordered the seizure of the French fleet on this date. And what triggered him to do this? Well, was the North Africa campaign, Operation Torch. And so he said, enough of this. So the Germans occupied Vichy. There was no more Vichy France after this. And part of this cleanup was they were going to take the French fleet. And I won't tell you what happened. That will reveal itself in tomorrow, the next day's video. But this was the day that Adolf Hitler ordered the seizure of the French fleet. And finally, today, on November 25th, 1943, the Battle of Cape St. George took place near Bougainville Island in the Solomons. Why is this noteworthy? Because this was the last surface battle between the Japanese Navy and the American Navy in the South Pacific. The next surface battle would only take place in 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when the American Army invaded the Philippines. In the Solomons, though, it was a whole different thing, because at that time, the Japanese Navy and the American Navy were pretty much even. In some ways, at the beginning of the campaign, the Japanese had a numerical advantage. They had better night fighting tactics, and the Americans weren't as experienced, and so they took their lumps at the beginning. But by this time, they had the advantage. They had better radar. They could see better in the dark than the Japanese could. Japanese still had their secret weapon, was their torpedoes. These long lance torpedoes just wreaked havoc in night battles with the American Navy, because they had such long range, 20,000 feet or miles. I should not on 20,000 miles. What is it? 20,000 yards. And they were reliable, and they could blow up an entire Navy ship with one torpedo. In this case, the Americans did manage to sink 3 Japanese destroyers, but the Japanese gave as good as they got, as they usually always did in the Solomon campaign. But that was what was noteworthy, was because this was the last surface battle in the Solomons, and the American Navy and the Marines and the Army were very happy to stop that campaign, because it was not a fun campaign in the tropics and jungle, steaming jungle, malaria, dengue fever. It was not fun. Well, it was fun to produce this video for you. I enjoy it. I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad you watched. I look forward to giving you another video tomorrow. Thanks.